The sound that still haunts me isn't the judge's gavel. It's the laugh. Not a nervous chuckle. Not disbelief. A full, careless laugh that echoed across the courtroom like I was a joke everyone else understood. My husband laughed as the judge handed him temporary full custody of our kids. He laughed while his attorney explained, calmly, clinically, why I was supposedly an unfit mother. He laughed while I sat there, numb, listening to my entire identity be dismantled sentence by sentence. 8 years of marriage. 2 children. A life I thought was real. Gone in under 20 minutes. My name is Elena Morales. I was 35 years old when my world collapsed inside a California family court. I was a mother to Sophia, 8, and Lucas, 5. And by the time that hearing ended, I was homeless, broke, and painted as a danger to the very children I had raised with my whole heart. This is the story of how they tried to erase me. And how their own lies buried them instead. The courtroom smelled like old paper and cheap coffee, the kind that had been reheated too many times. I remember gripping the edge of the wooden bench so hard my fingers went numb, afraid that if I let go, I might actually fall apart right there in front of everyone. My name, Elena Morales, was called, and suddenly my life was no longer private. It was a performance. Across the room sat my husband, Mark Holloway, looking nothing like the man I'd married. His suit was tailored, his posture relaxed, one arm casually resting on the table beside his attorney. He smiled, actually smiled, like this was a networking event instead of a custody hearing that would decide the future of our children. The judge began reviewing the case. Words like temporary, custody, and concern floated through the air, detached from the reality they carried. Mark's lawyer spoke confidently, presenting documents I'd never seen before. Charts. Statements. Claims about my instability, my emotional state, my lack of structure. Each sentence felt like a brick stacked on my chest. I wanted to interrupt. To object. To scream that none of this was true. But my lawyer, a tired man with a stack of folders held together by rubber bands, kept whispering, "Let them finish." I nodded, trusting the system the way you trust a railing not to give way. Then Mark stood up. He talked about how much he loved our kids, Sophia and Lucas. How he'd always been the stable parent. How I'd been overwhelmed lately. He said it with practiced concern, like a man reluctantly admitting a hard truth. The judge listened carefully. Took notes. Nodded. And then Mark laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A short, confident laugh when his attorney mentioned supervised visitation for me. Like it was obvious. Like it was deserved. The sound sliced through me sharper than any accusation. That laugh told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about concern. It was about control. The ruling came quickly. Temporary full custody to Mark. Supervised visitation for me. I felt the room tilt. My ears rang. The words echoed but didn't land all at once. I watched Mark shake his attorney's hand. I watched him glance back at me, victory written plainly on his face. He leaned over as we passed each other and whispered, "I told you I'd win." I didn't cry. Not then. Shock has a way of freezing tears in place. Outside the courtroom, my knees finally buckled. I sat on a cold bench in the hallway, staring at the floor while families walked past me, some relieved, some angry, some broken. I wondered which category I belonged to. Broken felt too small for what I was feeling. I had come into that courtroom believing truth mattered. That years of motherhood, school pickups, late-night fevers, and scraped knees would count for something. I left realizing that preparation mattered more. Strategy mattered more. And Mark had been preparing long before I ever knew there was a game. As I walked to my car alone, one thought settled heavy in my chest. If this was how easily I could be erased, then the only way forward was to stop assuming fairness would save me. This wasn't just a custody battle. It was a war I hadn't known I was already in. When I think back on my marriage to Mark, the memories feel edited, like someone went in afterward and cut out the warning signs. At the beginning, he was magnetic. Ambitious. The kind of man who spoke about the future as if it were already guaranteed. I was drawn to that certainty. After growing up in a household where everything felt fragile, Mark's confidence felt like safety. We met in our late 20s. I was working in community outreach, juggling grants and spreadsheets, while Mark was building his career in real estate development. He used to joke that I was the organized one, the person who kept life running smoothly. At the time, I took it as a compliment. I didn't realize how easily competence could turn into invisibility. After Sophia was born, things shifted. Mark's career demanded more time, more travel, more late nights. I stepped back from my job because it made sense financially. At least, that's how he framed it. "We're a team," he said. "I'll bring in the money, you manage the home." It sounded reasonable. Temporary. Loving, even. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent. I stopped seeing paychecks in my own name. Mark handled the accounts because it was easier. He added me as an authorized user on credit cards instead of a joint account holder. When I asked questions, he'd laugh lightly and say, "You don't need to worry about that stuff." Over time, I believed him. Trust isn't something that breaks all at once. It erodes quietly. By the time Lucas was born, my world had shrunk. I measured time in school schedules and pediatric appointments. Mark measured it in deals and deadlines. He praised me publicly for being a great mom while privately dismissing my concerns. If I felt exhausted, I was overreacting. If I felt anxious, I was imagining problems. Looking back, I see how carefully the imbalance was built. Mark made all the financial decisions, but I did the unpaid labor that kept his life seamless. I organized paperwork. I reminded him of obligations. I smoothed over conflicts. I told myself this was partnership. In reality, I was becoming dependent on someone who benefited from my dependence. When Mark's temper flared, it was never explosive enough to be obvious. Just enough to make me doubt myself. A sharp comment here. A cold silence there. He never hit me. He never screamed. He simply made sure I felt smaller after every disagreement. The cracks showed when I tried to reclaim space. When I mentioned going back to work, Mark questioned whether it was worth disrupting the kids. When I asked to review our finances together, he said I didn't trust him. Guilt became his favorite tool. I carried it willingly. So when the divorce came, part of me wasn't surprised. I just hadn't expected the precision of it. The way he'd positioned himself as the responsible one. The way I'd unknowingly stepped into the role of someone easily dismissed. Our marriage wasn't a partnership that failed. It was a structure designed to benefit one person, quietly, efficiently, and at my expense. Understanding that didn't erase the pain. But it did something more important. It showed me exactly where the truth had been buried. The divorce papers didn't arrive quietly. Mark made sure of that. They were served to me at my workplace, in the middle of a staff meeting, like some kind of performance. A man in a stiff suit stood at the doorway, scanned the room, and said my name out loud. Every head turned. I felt heat rush to my face as he handed me the envelope and walked away without a word. Mark later claimed it was a coincidence. I knew better. By the end of that week, the financial consequences hit harder than the embarrassment. My debit card declined at a grocery store while I was buying snacks for Sophia's class. I tried again, convinced it was a machine error. Declined. The cashier waited patiently, but I could feel the people behind me shifting, watching. I paid in cash I'd borrowed and held myself together until I reached the car. That night, I logged into our joint account, only to find it gone. Not empty. Gone. The login no longer worked. My email inbox held a polite message from Mark's lawyer explaining that temporary financial boundaries had been established to prevent conflict. In plain language, I'd been cut off. Bills I didn't recognize began arriving in my name. Credit cards opened without my knowledge. A car loan I'd never signed for. When I confronted Mark, he acted offended. He said I must have forgotten. Said stress affected memory. The audacity of being gaslit by paperwork was almost impressive. With no access to money and no stable income, I downsized fast. I moved into a small studio apartment miles from my kids' school. The walls were thin. The neighbors loud. The space barely big enough for my grief. Mark kept the house. The backyard. The routines I'd built. Meanwhile, he began reshaping the narrative. On social media, he posted pictures of the kids at soccer games and movie nights. Captions about new beginnings and doing what's best for family. People praised his strength. No one asked where I was. The worst moments came during supervised visitation. A stranger watched me hug my own children, timing our interactions like a transaction. Sophia asked why I couldn't come home. Lucas asked if he'd done something wrong. I smiled, swallowed, and told them I loved them. I never told them how humiliating it felt to be treated like a risk. Mark thrived in the imbalance. He delayed child support. He rescheduled visits at the last minute. Each inconvenience felt intentional. Designed to remind me how powerless I was. But desperation has a side effect no one warns you about. It sharpens perception. I began noticing inconsistencies. The debts in my name didn't match the lifestyle Mark displayed. His income claims didn't align with the money moving through accounts. The humiliation stripped away denial. For the first time, I stopped focusing on survival long enough to question the story I was being sold. And that was the beginning of the end. Because the trap Mark built to corner me was also exposing the lie he'd worked so hard to maintain. He thought humiliation would keep me quiet. Instead, it forced me to look closer. And what I saw didn't make sense at all. The box had been sitting in my mother's garage for years, buried behind old holiday decorations and a broken fan that never quite worked right. I hadn't thought about it once during the marriage or the divorce. In my mind, it belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed, the before version, when I still believed love automatically meant safety. I almost told her to throw it out. Something stopped me. Maybe instinct. Maybe desperation. Or maybe the quiet part of my brain that had finally woken up after months of survival mode. I told her I'd take it. That night, in my studio apartment with the flickering overhead light and the hum of traffic outside, I opened the box. It was exactly what I expected at first: outdated paperwork, cables I no longer recognized, an old planner with handwriting that looked younger and more hopeful. And then I saw it. A black external hard drive. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember why I had it. Then it came back to me. Years earlier, when the kids were babies, Mark had asked me to help organize his work files. He'd been too busy, which back then I'd taken as a compliment. I'd backed up folders, receipts, emails, anything he thought might be important. When things got hectic, I'd thrown everything into that box and forgotten it existed. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. At first, it looked harmless. Folders labeled with generic names. Spreadsheets filled with numbers that meant nothing to me. Then patterns started to form. Transfers that didn't align with pay stubs. Accounts I didn't recognize. Monthly deposits that were too consistent to be bonuses and too large to be reimbursements. I cross-checked dates. The money started moving right around the time Mark had convinced me to reduce my work hours for the family. My stomach dropped. As I dug deeper, emails surfaced. Conversations with his attorney, dated years before the divorce. Calm, methodical discussions about asset separation, future proceedings, and how to minimize exposure. One line burned itself into my brain: when the marriage is eventually dissolved. Eventually. He'd been planning this while I was packing lunches and rocking babies to sleep. I didn't cry. I felt something colder. Something steadier. I printed what I could. Screenshotted the rest. Labeled folders. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at yet, but I knew enough to recognize deception. This wasn't oversight. This was design. The next step was admitting I couldn't do this alone. At work, there was a woman named Claire who used to work in financial compliance before switching careers. We weren't close, but she'd always been kind. I asked her to meet for coffee, framing it like I needed advice. When I showed her the files, her expression changed completely. She didn't hesitate. "This isn't just hidden income," she said quietly. "This is fraud." The word landed heavy. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire helped me understand what Mark had done. Shell accounts. A quiet LLC. Money routed through consulting fees that didn't exist. Assets never disclosed. Income never reported. The deeper we went, the worse it got. I learned that while I was skipping meals to afford rent, Mark had purchased a vacation property through that LLC. A place I'd never seen. Never known about. Paid for with money earned during our marriage. I also learned he'd been paying his mother under the guise of administrative services. Tens of thousands of dollars over several years. A paper trail so obvious it was insulting. For the first time since the divorce, I slept through the night. Not because I felt safe, but because I finally felt prepared. Mark thought he'd buried me under paperwork, shame, and exhaustion. What he didn't realize was that he'd left behind the one thing that could bring him down. Proof. And once I had it, I wasn't going to waste it by rushing. I was going to be patient. I was going to be precise. And I was going to let him lie, one last time, where it mattered most. Once I understood what I was holding, everything changed, not on the outside, but inside me. I stopped reacting and started planning. That was the real shift. Fear had kept me frozen for months, but knowledge did something else entirely. Knowledge gave me leverage. Claire helped me connect with people she trusted. Not flashy names, not billboards or TV lawyers. Quiet professionals who lived in spreadsheets and footnotes and sworn statements. A forensic accountant named Daniel was the first. He spoke softly, almost gently, but the things he pointed out in Mark's records were brutal. He mapped the money like a crime scene, tracing where it came from, where it went, and, most importantly, where it was intentionally hidden. "This wasn't sloppy," Daniel said one afternoon, scrolling through highlighted entries. "This was deliberate." That sentence became my anchor. Through Daniel, I was referred to a family law attorney named Ruth Calder. She didn't smile much. She didn't waste words. When I finished explaining everything, she leaned back in her chair and said something I'll never forget. "We don't rush this. Men like your ex hang themselves if you give them enough rope." Ruth explained the strategy clearly. If we stormed into court waving evidence, Mark would scramble, settle, or try to spin a narrative that painted me as vindictive. Instead, we would let him feel safe. Comfortable. Victorious. We would make our first legal move look weak, almost embarrassing. A routine custody modification request. Emotional language. No financial accusations. No dramatic claims. Just a mother asking for more time with her kids. Mark took the bait immediately. His response was smug and dismissive. His attorney's filing dripped with confidence. They portrayed me as desperate, unstable, and grasping for relevance. Exactly what Ruth wanted. My job, she said, was to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. I had to stop reacting to provocations. Stop begging for extra visits. Stop arguing through lawyers. Stop showing up as anything other than a woman who had accepted her defeat. So I played the part. When Mark cancelled visits, I documented it quietly. When his mother posted photos of my kids online, I said nothing. When my sister stopped returning my calls, I let the silence stretch. I mentioned, casually and intentionally, that I was thinking about leaving the state. That California felt too hard. That maybe I needed a fresh start somewhere cheaper. I knew the information would travel. It always did. Meanwhile, Ruth prepared the real case in the background. Daniel refined his report. Claire continued digging, finding inconsistencies even Daniel had missed. And I kept living my small, quiet life, working extra shifts, eating ramen, sleeping in a studio that barely fit my grief. But I was no longer powerless. The most important step came when Ruth scheduled Mark's deposition. She framed it as procedural. Boring. Mandatory. Mark showed up relaxed, confident, almost amused. He wore the same expensive suit he'd worn to our original hearing, like armor. Ruth asked gentle questions. Income. Assets. Side businesses. Property ownership. Mark denied everything. Every single lie went on the record. I watched from the end of the table, my hands folded, my face neutral. Inside, I was counting. Every false statement was another brick in the wall closing around him. His attorney didn't object. Didn't interrupt. He thought this was routine. When it was over, Mark nodded at me like he'd just won something. I nodded back. That night, Ruth called me. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. He perjured himself, she said. Repeatedly. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. 8 months earlier, I'd been begging to see my children. Now, I was holding evidence that could dismantle the entire narrative he'd built around me. Ruth wasn't celebrating yet. Neither was I. This part is important, she said. You keep playing small. Let him get comfortable. The fall is harder that way. So I kept pretending I was losing. And Mark kept believing he was untouchable. Neither of us said it out loud, but the game had changed. He just didn't know it yet. By the time the final hearing was scheduled, Mark was relaxed in a way that felt almost obscene. He'd won every small battle for months, and it showed. His emails were curt, dismissive. His attorney stopped copying me on things unless legally required. To them, this hearing was a formality, a cleanup step before they closed the file and moved on. Ruth, on the other hand, was calm in a way that made my stomach twist. Tomorrow, she said the night before, you don't react. You don't speak unless asked. You let the evidence talk. Walking into the courthouse that morning felt surreal. 8 months earlier, I'd walked into the same building shaking, terrified, already half defeated. This time, I wore the same simple navy dress I'd worn to job interviews, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Mark arrived with confidence and a thin folder. I arrived with Ruth, Daniel, and 3 thick binders that could barely stay closed. Mark noticed. I saw the flicker of uncertainty cross his face before he masked it. The judge wasted no time. Ruth began by requesting the original custody ruling be revisited due to newly discovered evidence of financial fraud and perjury. Mark's attorney immediately objected, calling it a desperate fishing expedition. Ruth didn't argue. She simply handed over Daniel's report. That was the moment the room shifted. Daniel testified first. Calm, precise, relentless. He walked the court through shell accounts, hidden income streams, and discrepancies between Mark's sworn statements and actual financial activity. He explained how money was routed through an LLC that had never been disclosed during the divorce. How property had been purchased quietly. How debts had been shifted into my name while assets disappeared. Mark's attorney tried to interrupt. The judge shut him down. Then Ruth played excerpts from Mark's deposition. His voice filled the courtroom, confident and false. No additional income. No outside businesses. No undisclosed assets. Lie after lie, in his own words. Mark leaned forward, whispering urgently to his lawyer. His confidence evaporated in real time. Next came evidence of manipulation. Ruth presented records showing denied visitation, last-minute cancellations, and messages implying that access to the children depended on my cooperation. The judge's expression hardened. Parental alienation was no longer a suggestion, it was a pattern. When Ruth rested her case, the courtroom was silent. Mark's attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. Mark was called to testify. This time, there was no swagger. His answers were clipped. Defensive. Contradictory. When confronted with financial documents, he claimed confusion. When asked why assets were hidden, he blamed bad advice. When questioned about debts opened in my name, he said it was a misunderstanding. The judge didn't buy it. At one point, she stopped him mid-sentence and asked, "Do you understand what perjury means, Mr. Holloway?" He nodded, pale. By the time closing statements ended, I felt hollow. Not scared, empty. Like something inside me had burned itself out and left only clarity behind. The judge recessed briefly. When she returned, her ruling was firm and devastating. The original custody order was set aside. Temporary full custody was granted to me, effective immediately. Mark's visitation would be supervised pending further evaluation. The court ordered a full forensic audit of all assets and referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation into fraud and perjury. Mark stared straight ahead, unmoving. I didn't look at him. As we exited the courtroom, Ruth squeezed my arm. "This is only the beginning," she said. "But today, you won." I stepped into the hallway where my children waited with my mother. When my son ran into my arms and asked if we were going home together, the weight of the past year finally broke. Yes, I told him. And for the first time in a very long time, it was the truth. The days after the hearing felt unreal, like the world had tilted and I was still learning how to stand on new ground. Temporary full custody meant the kids came home with me that same afternoon. Not visitation. Not a schedule negotiated through lawyers. Home. We piled into my aging car with backpacks and school folders and the quiet shock of change hanging in the air. At first, they were cautious. Sophia kept asking if they had to go back. Lucas slept with the light on. I didn't push. I didn't explain everything. I let consistency do the talking, breakfast at the table, school drop-offs, bedtime stories. Love without conditions. Safety without bargaining. Mark, meanwhile, unraveled. His attorney withdrew within a week, citing irreconcilable differences. The forensic audit expanded quickly, uncovering more than Daniel originally suspected, additional accounts, undeclared stock compensation, and payments routed through relatives. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation. Suddenly, Mark wasn't the confident executive with the perfect narrative. He was a man scrambling to explain years of lies to people who didn't care about his charm. His mother tried damage control. She called me twice. I didn't answer. Then she emailed, accusing me of tearing the family apart, of being vindictive, of poisoning the kids against their father. I forwarded everything to Ruth. Silence followed. The social circle shifted too. Friends who had quietly drifted away began reaching out, awkward apologies wrapped in casual messages. Didn't know the full story. Hope you're doing okay. I responded politely but briefly. I wasn't interested in reclaiming an image. I was building a life. Paloma showed up at my door one evening, eyes red, shoulders hunched. She hadn't testified yet, that was still coming, but the weight of what she'd helped enable had finally caught up with her. She said she'd been scared. That she'd believed Mark when he said I was unstable. That she thought siding with him would keep her safe. I told her safety built on betrayal always collapses. She nodded. She didn't argue. She asked what she could do now. Tell the truth, I said. And accept the consequences. She did. Her affidavit became part of the expanded case, evidence of manipulation, coercion, and witness coaching. It didn't erase the damage, but it mattered. Mark's world kept shrinking. His company placed him on administrative leave pending the investigation. The condo he'd hidden was frozen. Accounts were flagged. Creditors came calling. The image he'd curated, successful, generous, blameless, crumbled under scrutiny. Through it all, I stayed focused on the kids. Therapy appointments. School meetings. Small routines that stitched us back together. The court ordered reunification counseling to address the alienation, and slowly, painfully, the lies loosened their grip. Sophia admitted she'd been told I chose to leave. Lucas confessed he'd been warned not to talk about certain things. I held them and told them the truth, gently and age-appropriately, that adults make mistakes, that sometimes people lie to protect themselves, and that none of this was their fault. The final hearing loomed, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had learned something essential in the wreckage of the past year, that dignity isn't given back by a court order. You rebuild it yourself, piece by piece, by refusing to disappear. Mark tried one last time to negotiate. He sent a message through Ruth, offering a settlement if I agreed to reduce charges and keep things civil. The implication was clear: spare him the full consequences. Ruth asked what I wanted to do. I thought about the laughter in the courtroom months earlier. The humiliation. The nights I couldn't afford dinner. The children asking why I didn't love them enough to stay. No, I said. We finish this. And for the first time, I understood that justice isn't revenge. It's accountability catching up, slowly, publicly, and without mercy. The final ruling didn't come with drama. No shouting. No grand speeches. Just a judge reading from a stack of papers while Mark sat very still, hands folded, like a man bracing for impact he could no longer avoid. I listened carefully, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I needed to hear it said out loud, to make it real. Full legal and physical custody was awarded to me. The judge cited financial fraud, perjury, and sustained parental alienation. Mark's visitation would remain supervised until further review. All hidden assets identified through the forensic audit were deemed marital property. I was awarded the family home and a majority share of the recovered funds as restitution. Mark was ordered to pay child support based on his actual income, plus my legal fees. The matter of criminal charges would proceed separately. Mark didn't look at me when it ended. He gathered his things slowly, like someone packing up a life that no longer fit in a briefcase. I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. Life after the ruling was quieter than I expected. There were no victory parades. Just practical steps: changing locks, transferring utilities, reopening bank accounts in my own name. The kids moved back into their rooms. Sophia hung new drawings on the fridge. Lucas insisted on sleeping with the door open for a while, just to be sure. We went to therapy together. We talked about trust, about fear, about how grown-ups can be wrong without children being to blame. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were easy. Some days felt like starting over. But every morning, they woke up in a home where no one was keeping score. Paloma and I started rebuilding slowly. Boundaries first. Honesty always. Forgiveness wasn't a switch, it was a process. She didn't ask to be forgiven. She showed up when invited. She listened. That mattered. Mark faded from daily life. Supervised visits were stiff and uncomfortable. The kids came home confused at first, then calmer as the consistency settled in. He stopped trying to negotiate through lawyers. Eventually, he stopped trying at all. consequences have a way of shrinking people who once took up too much space. I went back to work full-time. I opened a savings account with my name only. I learned how to read financial statements, how to ask questions, how to trust my instincts again. Power, I realized, isn't loud. It's quiet confidence built on understanding. One evening, months later, I stood in the backyard watching the kids play as the sun dipped low. The same space I'd once watched from a distance, feeling erased. Now, it was mine again, not because a judge said so, but because I'd fought for it. Revenge stories usually end with spectacle. Mine ended with peace. Mark had laughed at me once, certain I was finished. He was wrong. The real victory wasn't taking something from him. It was reclaiming everything he tried to convince me I'd lost, my voice, my children, and the unshakable knowledge that I am capable of surviving what was meant to destroy me. And that kind of win lasts. They say revenge is loud, messy, and destructive. But the truth I learned is this: the strongest revenge is survival paired with truth. It's rebuilding quietly while the people who tried to erase you unravel under the weight of their own lies. I didn't win because Mark lost. I won because I stood back up. I reclaimed my children, my dignity, and my future, not through bitterness, but through clarity, patience, and courage. The woman who once begged for crumbs now owns her life fully. And that lesson? It's one I'll pass down to my children every single day. If you're reading this while feeling powerless, remember this: the truth always has a longer memory than lies.